You are not supposed to be here. It is a little after 11 at night in Rome, and St. Peter's Square has emptied the way old public places empty. Not all at once, but in stages. The tour groups went first, folding their maps, following raised umbrellas back toward the river. Then the pilgrims, moving more slowly, stopping to look back at the facade one last time. Then the last of the photographers, waiting for the floodlights to reach full strength against the darkening sky. And now, there is only the sound of water. 2 fountains, one on either side of the obelisk, still running, as they have run for 400 years, because nobody ever turns them off. The stone underfoot is cooling. The heat that gathered in the paving all afternoon is lifting away into a sky the color of wet ink, and the great curved arms of the colonnade stand half in light, half in shadow, holding the emptiness in place. Somewhere behind you, a small door, in a much larger door, is unlocked from the inside. You hear it before you see it, a key turning in a mechanism that was cut by hand a very long time ago, and has been oiled and turned and oiled again by people whose names were never written down anywhere. The sound is unhurried. Whoever is on the other side has done this 10,000 times. The door opens perhaps the width of a shoulder. No one speaks. A hand appears at the edge of the frame, and then the shape of a man in a dark suit, older than you expected, entirely unremarkable, the sort of face you would forget within an hour of meeting. He looks at you for a moment. Then he steps back and tilts his head very slightly, the way a person does when they are letting you pass without wanting to make a ceremony of it. The threshold is worn into a shallow curve. Countless feet have crossed here, and stone gives way eventually, even to something as soft as a footstep, if you give it enough centuries. You step through, and the door closes behind you. The first thing that changes is the temperature. Outside there was still the last of the day in the air, that faint Roman warmth that lingers in the walls until midnight. Here it is, several degrees cooler, and completely still. The second thing that changes is the sound. Not silence exactly. Buildings this size are never truly silent, but the removal of every noise you did not know you were listening to. No traffic on the Via della Conciliazione. No footsteps but your own and his. Only a low, enormous hush, the sound a very large volume of air makes when it has nowhere to go. He turns and walks ahead of you into a corridor lit by 3 small lamps set far apart, and you follow. The floor here is marble, polished by use rather than by machine, and it holds a faint smear of light along its length. The walls are plain at this height, and then, somewhere above the reach of the lamps, they become something else. You can sense the change more than see it. An edge of gilding, the corner of a painted cornice, the suggestion of a ceiling that is doing far more work than any ceiling needs to do. Give your eyes a moment. They will take longer to adjust than you expect, because they have spent the evening under floodlights, and the working lamps in here are the yellow of old filament, rather than the white of anything modern. Shapes arrive in order. First the floor, because it holds the light. Then the line where the wall meets the floor. Then the door frames, which are always the last thing to make sense in a dark corridor, appearing as slightly deeper rectangles of nothing. The air has a smell, and it is very specific and completely unlike the outside. Cold stone first, then wax, floor polish and candle wax, decades of both, worked into everything porous. Under that, faintly, the smell of old paper and old textile, which is what a building produces when it has been storing things carefully for a long time. And beneath all of it, so faint you might be inventing it, incense, which does not fully leave a place once it has been used there regularly for hundreds of years. Your footsteps sound different from his. He walks on the outer edge of his soles, quietly, the way people do when they have spent years not disturbing anyone. He does not explain anything. That is not what he is for. And so you walk, and the questions arrive on their own. What actually happens inside the Vatican when the crowds have gone? What is underneath the Basilica, in the dark, below the level where anyone is permitted to stand? What is genuinely kept in the archive that people spent 400 years calling secret? How does a territory smaller than many city parks hold the attention of more than 1 billion people scattered across every continent on Earth? Why have architecture and ritual and restricted access always been part of how this place works? And what do the locked doors truly protect, as opposed to what the world imagines is behind them? Some of those questions have clean answers. Some have answers that historians still argue about with great energy and very little agreement. And some of them are not questions at all, but feelings, dressed up as questions. Because standing in a dark corridor at the edge of the oldest continuously functioning institution in Europe does something to the mind that is difficult to put into ordinary words. You have all night. There is no hurry at all. Before the corridor takes us any further in, let me say a quiet word about a few things, and then we will not be interrupted again. If tonight's journey settles something in you, there is a book that grew out of these documentaries, Sleep into Power. It is an exploration of sleep and identity, how imagination, psychology, and philosophy meet in the last hour of the day, and what can be done, practically and gently, with the mind you carry into the dark. It is available on Amazon in paperback and Kindle. If you would rather listen to these episodes elsewhere, Sleep into Power is on Spotify, and you will find the full library waiting there. If you are looking for something quieter still, guided meditation, mindfulness, ambient relaxation, and calming work for sleep, that lives on the companion channel, Meditate into Power. And if you would ever like to support the making of these documentaries directly, there is a Buy Me a Coffee page. It is entirely optional and never expected. Your listening is already the thing that keeps this going. Now, the corridor. It runs longer than it looked from the doorway, and it ends in a turn to the left, and beyond the turn there is a window, unglazed at the top, open to the night. Through it you can see a slice of courtyard, a wall the color of old paper, and above that, floating in the floodlight with nothing appearing to hold it up, the dome. You have seen it in photographs your whole life. It is different from underneath, at night, with no one else there. It helps, standing here, to understand exactly what you have walked into, because the answer is stranger than most people assume. Vatican City is a country, not a district, not a religious campus, not a museum complex with unusual security. A sovereign state with its own passports, its own postal service, its own pharmacy, its own railway station of one platform that is almost never used, its own fire brigade, and a population that hovers somewhere under 1,000 people. It is the smallest independent state in the world by both area and population. You could walk its entire border in less than an hour, and much of that walk would be along a wall, roughly 110 acres, less than half a square kilometer, set inside another city, on the west bank of the Tiber, on a low hill that the Romans never much liked and never seriously built on, because the water there was poor and the ground was marshy, and the whole area had a reputation for bad air. They called the hill the Vaticanus. Nobody has ever satisfactorily explained the name. The state itself is young. It was created in 1929 by the Lateran Treaty, signed between the Holy See and the Kingdom of Italy, and it settled an argument that had been running, bitterly, for 59 years. Before 1870, the popes had ruled a large band of territory across central Italy, the Papal States, for over 1,000 years. When Italian unification swept that territory away, and Rome became the capital of a new Italian kingdom, the papacy refused to accept the loss. Successive popes declined to leave the Vatican grounds at all, describing themselves as prisoners, and the standoff hardened into something that Italian politics simply carried around with it like a stone in a shoe. The treaty ended it by shrinking the problem. Italy recognized the sovereignty of a very small state. The Holy See recognized the Kingdom of Italy and the loss of everything else. And in that exchange, something clarifying happened. The papacy stopped being a modest territorial power in Europe and became something less easily measured. It kept its independence, and it gave up its geography. That distinction matters more than any of the guidebooks tend to explain. So hold it lightly as we walk. Vatican City is the territory. The walls, the gardens, the buildings, the postboxes. The Holy See is the thing that actually acts in the world, the governing body of the Catholic Church, which sends and receives ambassadors, signs treaties, holds permanent observer status at the United Nations, and maintains formal diplomatic relations with roughly 180 countries. Those relations do not exist because of the 110 acres. They existed long before the 110 acres, and they would survive the loss of them, which is the first idea worth carrying through the rest of the night. Power is usually described in physical terms: armies, borders, resources, the capacity to compel. But there is another kind, older and far less visible, that runs on continuity, symbolism, memory, ceremony, and the careful management of information. And it is remarkably durable because it does not depend on winning. An institution that can make its own authority feel timeless, that can preserve its records when other archives burn, that can produce the same gestures in the same rooms across a span of centuries, accumulates a form of weight that has nothing to do with the number of soldiers it can put in a field. This place has been running that experiment longer than almost anyone. The custodian has stopped at an iron gate set into the colonnade, and he is opening it. Beyond, the square. You step out of the shadow of the columns onto open paving, and the space arrives all at once. By daylight, with 30,000 people in it, the square feels like a place you are queuing across. Empty, it feels like a room. Bernini designed it that way, between 1656 and 1667, and he described the colonnades openly as arms, the arms of the church, reaching out to embrace the faithful and to gather in those who were wavering. It is a warm and generous image, and it is also, if you look at it from a slightly different angle, a piece of very precise crowd engineering. 4 rows of columns, deep enough to make covered corridors on both sides. Nearly 300 columns in total, and above them, along the top of the entablature, more than 130 statues of saints, each about 3 meters tall, each looking down into the space you are standing in. In daylight, they read as decoration. At night, lit from below, they read as a congregation. There is nowhere in the square where you are not being observed by stone. Walk out toward the center, and the ground rises very slightly. At the middle stands the obelisk, red granite, 25 meters of it, and this is the oldest thing in view by a wide margin. It was cut in Egypt. Caligula had it shipped to Rome to stand in the spine of a circus laid out on this hill, and it stood there, roughly where the sacristy is now, through the fires and the emperors and the collapse of everything that had brought it. In 1586, Sixtus V decided it should be moved to the center of the square, and the engineer Domenico Fontana moved it. 900 men, 140 horses, 44 winches, and an operation so tense that a story grew up afterwards about the crowd being ordered into silence on pain of death. Touch the base. The stone is cold and slightly damp, and it holds the shape of tooling done by hands that had never heard of Christianity. Look down at what you are standing on, because the square is not the flat plate it appears to be. The paving is laid in a great oval of dark cobbles, cut through by broad lines of white travertine that radiate outward from the obelisk like the spokes of a wheel. Around the base, set into the ground, there is a compass rose with the names of the winds. And at 2 points, one on either side of the obelisk, there are small round stones, marked as the centers of the 2 curves. Stand exactly on one of them and look toward the colonnade, and the 4 rows of columns line up perfectly, so that all of them collapse into one. 400 years ago, A man worked out on paper where a person would have to stand for that to happen, and then built a colonnade so that it would. The trick still works. It will work tomorrow, and for anyone who stands there in 100 years. There is something almost tender about that, at 3 in the morning, with nobody there to try it. The ground also slopes. The square drains toward its edges, invisibly, so that Roman rain does not stand on it. Everything about this space is engineered, and almost none of the engineering is visible, which is the definition of the thing being done well. Beyond the colonnade on the right, a covered passage runs from the palace toward the river, the Passetto, an elevated walkway on top of a wall, built in the 13th century and improved afterwards, which exists for exactly one reason, so that a pope under attack could leave the Vatican without setting foot on open ground. It was used in 1494, and again, famously, in 1527, while the Swiss Guard were dying behind him. The wall is still there. You can see the top of it from here, a dark line running off toward the castle by the Tiber, unlit, entirely ordinary, holding one of the more revealing facts about this place, that for most of its history, the people who lived here were not certain they were safe. The fountains keep going. The one on the right is the older, finished under Moderno in the early 1600s. The one on the left was added some 60 years later to balance it, because Bernini's plan required symmetry, and the popes of that century were willing to pay for symmetry. The water goes up, spreads, falls into the upper basin, overflows the rim in a continuous curtain, and hits the lower basin with a sound like rain on leaves. It does this all night, to nobody. Turn and face the Basilica. The facade is enormous and, most critics agree, not entirely successful. It is wide enough that from the middle of the square it hides the dome behind it, which is a strange thing for a building to do to its own best feature. Above the columns, the statues of Christ and 11 apostles stand along the roofline. To the right, high up, the windows of the Apostolic Palace, where the papal apartments are. Most of them are dark. What happens behind them is not our business tonight, and speculation about the private hours of living people is the cheapest kind of storytelling there is. The custodian is already walking toward the steps. The doors of St. Peter's are bronze and very heavy, and the one he uses opens only far enough for a person. Inside the portico, the floodlights end and the working lights take over, dim, warm, spaced along the walls at intervals that leave long stretches of darkness between them. Then the inner door and the nave. There is a particular effect that this building produces, and it is worth naming, because it is entirely deliberate. The interior does not read as large. It reads as normal, and then, slowly, over about 30 seconds, your sense of scale collapses. The cause is proportion. Every element in here is enlarged in step with every other element, so there is nothing obviously oversized to measure against. The cherubs holding the holy water stoops near the entrance look like plump children until you stand beside one and find it is nearly 2 meters tall. The lettering that runs in a band around the base of the dome looks like elegant script. Each letter is roughly the height of a person. The nave runs almost 200 meters from the door to the far apse, which means that from where you are standing, the great bronze canopy over the high altar appears to be a comfortable stroll away, and it is not. Start walking, and the floor tells you what is happening. Set into the marble down the length of the nave are brass markers showing the lengths of the other great churches of the world: St. Paul's in London, the Cathedral of Milan, Cologne, Seville. Each one marked at the point where it would end if you laid it down inside this one. You pass them one by one, like buoys. It is a slightly graceless piece of triumphalism, and it works perfectly. The sound here is its own phenomenon. Your footsteps arrive back at you a moment late and from the wrong direction. A whisper travels absurd distances, and underneath it all there is a low, continuous tone, more felt than heard, which is simply the resonance of a very large sealed volume of air. Sailors sometimes say that ocean silence has a hum in it. This is the architectural version. Above, the dome. Michelangelo took the commission in 1547, in his early 70s, and refused payment for it. He did not live to see it finished. When he died in 1564, the drum was built, but the vault was not. And it was Giacomo della Porta and Domenico Fontana who closed it, working through 1588 and 1589 at a speed that astonished everyone. Stand directly beneath it, look up, and the ribs converge on a lantern that is well over 100 meters above your head. The gold mosaic catches the working lights and gives back almost nothing, so what you mostly see is a great ring of darkness with a suggestion of pattern in it. Beneath that, Bernini's baldachin, the twisting bronze canopy over the papal altar, finished in 1634. 4 spiral columns, each the height of a good-sized building, cast from bronze that was famously stripped from the portico of the Pantheon, a piece of recycling that offended Roman opinion at the time and produced a joke that has outlived everyone involved in it. The columns are not smooth. Bronze bees, laurel, small climbing figures, and lizards move up the spirals, and if you follow one column upward at night, the shapes come and go in the shadow, as though something on the surface is very slowly turning. This is not the first church here. That is the thing to hold on to. The first basilica on this site was built under Constantine in the 4th century, in the decades after Christianity moved from persecuted sect to imperial favor. It was a huge and rather plain hall, 5 aisles, a wooden roof, and it stood for something over 1,000 years, filling gradually with tombs, altars, mosaics, imperial coronations, and layer upon layer of accumulated history. By the 15th century it was also visibly failing. The south wall leaned, the roof was rotten. The decision to demolish it and start again was made by Julius II in 1505, and it remains one of the most consequential acts of destruction in the history of European art. Contemporaries were appalled. The old basilica was not merely a building, it was the accumulated memory of the Western Church, and it was taken apart in pieces over the following decades, while the new one rose around and above its remains. What replaced it took 120 years and consumed the talent of almost every major architect of the period. Bramante began it, and was nicknamed the Wrecker for his enthusiasm. Raphael followed. Antonio da Sangallo the Younger followed him. Michelangelo returned the design to something closer to Bramante's clarity. Carlo Maderno lengthened the nave and built the facade. Bernini finished the interior and laid out the square. 6 generations of workmen were born and died inside the project, and the money. This is where the story becomes genuinely difficult, and where it is worth being careful, because it is usually told badly. The rebuilding was ruinously expensive, and one of the instruments used to raise funds was the preaching of indulgences, remissions of temporal punishment for sin, granted under specified conditions, which in practice became associated with financial contribution. The theology behind indulgences is older and more nuanced than the practice that grew around it. The practice, in the early 16th century, in parts of Germany, became a straightforward commercial operation, entangled with banking debts and episcopal appointments, and preached in terms that many clergy at the time found indefensible. In 1517, an Augustinian friar and university lecturer named Martin Luther set out 95 theses for academic debate, several of which attacked exactly this. What followed split Western Christianity permanently. It is tempting to reduce that to a single tidy sentence. The Basilica caused the Reformation. It did not. The Reformation had roots running back through a century and more of reformers, theological argument, national resentment of Roman taxation, printing, literacy, and the ordinary politics of German princes. The building was an occasion, not a cause. But it is fair and important to say that this floor you are standing on was partly paid for by a fundraising campaign that helped tear the church in half, and that the same institution which produced the abuse also produced, within a generation, the reforming council that abolished the sale of indulgences outright. Both things are true. Most of the history in this building is like that. Move sideways, into the first chapel on the right, where a single lamp burns behind a wall of armored glass. The Pietà was carved by Michelangelo when he was 23, working in Rome on his first major commission, from a single block of Carrara marble, chosen for its whiteness and its lack of flaw. It is a young mother holding the body of a grown man across her lap, a composition that should not work, because the proportions are impossible, and which does work, because he built the whole thing around the fall of her robe, and made the fabric carry the weight the anatomy cannot. There is a story, probably true, that he overheard visitors crediting the work to a rival from Milan, returned that night with a lamp and a chisel, and cut his name along the band that crosses the Virgin's breast. It is the only piece he ever signed. He is said to have regretted it afterwards, and never signed another thing in his life. It has been behind glass since 1972, when a man with a hammer got past the barrier and did considerable damage in a matter of seconds before he was pulled away. The repairs took months and were done well. You cannot see them from here. Out again, into the nave, and along the right-hand aisle to a pillar where a bronze figure sits on a marble throne. This is the seated Saint Peter, medieval, generally attributed to Arnolfo di Cambio in the 13th century, though some argue for a much earlier date. He holds keys in one hand and raises the other. What draws the eye is his right foot extended slightly beyond the base and worn away, not chipped, not damaged, but smoothed into a rounded stump, the toes almost entirely gone. That is skin. Centuries of hands and lips, one at a time, each contact removing an amount of bronze too small to measure. No single pilgrim did that. All of them together did. Run a finger over it in the dark and the metal is glassy and slightly warm, and you are touching a surface shaped by the accumulated affection of millions of people who are all now dead. There is another detail here that visitors almost never notice, and it changes how you see the whole interior. Look at the altarpieces. The great scenes above the side altars, with their draperies and their skies and their soft flesh tones. They are not paintings. Almost none of them are. They are mosaics, assembled from millions of hand-cut pieces of colored glass, made in a workshop that has operated within these walls since the late 16th century and still exists today. The originals were painted on canvas and moved elsewhere, because canvas rots in a damp building and glass does not. Go close. From 2 paces away, the illusion is total. From 20 centimeters, the surface breaks into a field of tiny irregular tiles, tens of thousands of shades, laid by people whose entire working lives were spent reproducing brushstrokes in stone and glass, so that the image would survive them by 1,000 years. The whole building is like that. Every decision made with a time horizon that no ordinary institution ever uses. At the far end of the entrance wall, the last door on the right is bricked shut. It is opened only at the start of a holy year, in a ceremony where the masonry is broken away and the door swung inward, and then sealed again when the year closes. Between those occasions it simply stands there, a doorway that is not a doorway, waiting out the interval in the dark. Walk on past the altar, into the transept, and the side chapels open out. Monuments to popes lie in rows, some magnificent, some austere, some to men whose reigns lasted a matter of weeks. Marble skeletons, marble virtues, marble mourning women, the whole vocabulary of Baroque death, executed by craftsmen who could make stone look like cloth and cloth look like it was moving. Down here, at floor level, in the near dark, the effect is oddly gentle. The building has stopped performing. It is simply very large, very cold, and very old, and it is waiting. Near the crossing, in front of the high altar, the floor drops away in a horseshoe of marble steps, and a low balustrade rings it. 99 oil lamps burn there permanently. Below the lamps, behind a bronze grille, there is a niche, and in the niche, a box, and beneath the box, the reason all of this exists. The custodian has stopped. He is looking at a small door to one side, and he has a second key ready. The stairway is narrow and turns twice, and the air changes on the second turn, cooler, heavier, carrying the mineral smell of stone that has never fully dried. You come out into a low vaulted space, with a floor of plain slabs, and after the vast dark of the nave, the ceiling feels close enough to touch. These are the Vatican grottos. They are, in the simplest terms, the gap between two buildings. When the new basilica was raised, its floor was set roughly 3 meters above the floor of the old Constantinian church, and rather than fill the void, the builders vaulted it and kept it. So the ground you were walking on 10 minutes ago is the roof of this one, and the floor here is, more or less, the floor of the 4th century. What fills the space is graves. Popes mostly, around 90 of them, arranged along corridors and inside chapels, some in carved sarcophagi, some beneath plain slabs cut with a name and 2 dates and nothing else. Sovereigns are here too. A Swedish queen who abdicated her throne and converted. The last of the exiled Stuarts, who died in Rome still styling themselves kings of England. Fragments of the old basilica are set into the walls. A piece of mosaic, a column drum, a carved lion whose face has worn to a suggestion. At night, nobody is here at all. There is no reverberation in these ceilings. Sound simply stops. When you pause, the quiet is total, and it has a texture that the nave upstairs did not have, the particular deadness of being under something extremely heavy. Take it slowly. There is no reason to hurry through a place like this. And now the distinction that most visitors never quite get straight, because the two things sit almost on top of one another. The grottos are not the necropolis. The grottos are the medieval and modern burial level, accessible, well-lit, part of the standard visit. The necropolis is far older, considerably deeper, and requires a booking made months ahead, with a small office that admits a limited number of people each day, in groups, with a guide. That lower level is a street. In the 1st and 2nd centuries, this hillside was ordinary Roman ground, outside the city proper, the kind of land where you buried people, because the law forbade burial inside the walls. Families of modest means built small tomb houses along a lane, running roughly east to west. Brick structures with doorways and roof tiles and painted interiors, each holding the urns, and later the bodies of one household. They had thresholds and lintels and inscriptions, asking passers-by not to damage the property. Some had little courtyards. A few had mosaics. It was, in other words, a suburb of the dead, laid out like a suburb of the living, and its inhabitants were pagan Romans, with 1 or 2 exceptions. Then, in the 4th century, Constantine's engineers came and did something extraordinarily inconvenient. Rather than build on the flat ground below, they cut into the slope, filled the tombs with rubble to make a level platform, and put the basilica directly over them, burying an entire cemetery in order to place the church precisely here. That decision cost enormous effort and made no architectural sense whatsoever, and it only becomes intelligible if they believed that a specific point on that hillside had to sit beneath the altar. The excavation of what they buried happened almost entirely within living memory. In 1939, during work to prepare a burial place for Pius XI, workmen broke into a Roman structure below the grotto floor. Pius XII authorized a full archaeological investigation, conducted quietly through the war years, and the results were announced in 1950. What the excavators uncovered was the street. Some 24 tomb houses, in remarkable condition, still bearing their painted walls and their family names. And at the point directly beneath the high altar, beneath the layers of medieval and Renaissance rebuilding, they found a modest structure set against a wall, a small niche framed by 2 columns, built into a field of graves, dating to somewhere around the middle of the 2nd century. Early Christian writers had described such a thing. Around the year 200, a Roman priest named Gaius referred in a letter to the trophies of the apostles, saying that Peter's could be found on the Vatican Hill. The excavators had found a monument in exactly the place he indicated, of exactly the right date, and had found that the graves around it were crowded in tightly against it, as people do when they want to be buried near something that matters. Here the ground becomes uneven, and it is worth walking carefully. That there is a 2nd century shrine beneath the altar is archaeological fact, agreed by essentially everyone. That the shrine was built to mark the burial place of the Apostle Peter is a historical interpretation, a strong one, supported by written testimony and by the behavior of the surrounding graves, and disputed at the edges by scholars who point out that a shrine records a belief held in the 2nd century, not necessarily a fact of the 1st. Beyond that, the ground is softer still. Bones were recovered from a compartment in the adjacent wall, a wall covered in scratched graffiti, one fragment of which was read by the epigrapher Margherita Guarducci as a Greek phrase meaning "Peter is here." In 1968, Paul VI announced that relics identified as the apostles had been found in a manner the Church considered convincing. Not all specialists agreed with the identification, and some still do not. Careful writing keeps those 3 layers separate: the evidence, the interpretation, and the belief. Each is real, they are not the same kind of thing. The tomb houses themselves deserve a slower look because they are not what people expect of a place beneath a basilica. They are cheerful. That is the surprising thing. The families who built them were not aristocrats. They were freedmen, tradesmen, minor officials, people with enough money for a small brick building and a decent inscription. Their walls were plastered and painted in warm reds and yellows. There are stucco garlands, painted birds, vines. One tomb has a mosaic floor of a chariot. Another, the figure of a young man with the tools of his trade beside him. The names above the doors are ordinary Roman names, and several of the inscriptions include the standard formula of the period, warning that this ground belongs to a particular family and their descendants, and is not to be sold on. They expect it to be visited. That is the point of a burial street rather than a burial field. Roman families came out on anniversaries with food and wine, and some of these tombs have benches, and 1 or 2 have small openings through which a libation could be poured down to the dead. Grief here was social, seasonal, and practical. Among them, in one small mausoleum belonging to a family called the Julii, there is a ceiling mosaic on a gold ground showing a figure in a chariot with rays coming from his head. In Roman terms, that is the sun god, but the vine leaves woven around him belong to a different vocabulary, and most scholars read it as an early Christian image, Christ rendered in the visual language available at the time, because no other visual language existed yet. It is a tiny thing, in a cramped chamber, in the dark, under several thousand tons of later architecture, and it is one of the earliest surviving attempts to picture a new idea, using the only pictures anyone had. The excavators worked here through the war, in conditions that were physically miserable. Low headroom, groundwater seeping in, the constant awareness that they were tunneling beneath the foundations of the largest church in the world. Shoring had to be inserted as they went. The work was conducted quietly, with almost no public announcement, partly because Rome in those years had other matters on its mind, and partly because nobody knew what would be found. What is beyond dispute is stranger, in a way, than any of the arguments about it. Somebody, in the middle of the 2nd century, when Christians in Rome were a small and periodically persecuted minority, with no money and no legal protection, went to the trouble of building a monument on this hillside. 150 years later, an emperor rearranged a mountainside to put a basilica over it. 1200 years after that, the greatest artists in Europe were employed to demolish and replace that basilica, and they kept the point fixed, to within a meter, across the whole reconstruction. Every altar since has been oriented to it. An entire institution has spent 2,000 years being extremely careful not to lose one spot in the ground. Stand still for a moment and let that arrange itself downward. At the top, the night sky over Rome. Below that, the dome and its lantern. Below that, the marble floor and the brass markers and the 99 lamps. Below that, this vaulted corridor and its silent rows of tombs. Below that, the ruins of an emperor's church. Below that, rubble packed by hand in the 4th century. And below that, a lane of brick houses where families once brought food and wine on anniversaries and sat outside the doorways of their dead. None of those layers knew what would be built on top of it. The lamps down here are on a timer, and one of them clicks and dims further as you pass, resetting itself for the night. The way from the basilica to the chapel is not the way visitors go. Visitors approach through kilometers of museum galleries, herded along a fixed route, arriving at the end of a long afternoon with sore feet and a full memory card. Tonight the route is a service corridor, a courtyard crossed diagonally under a sky with 2 visible stars, a flight of stairs, and a door. The custodian opens it, reaches inside, and turns on a single low circuit, not the display lighting, just enough to move by. The Sistine Chapel, empty. The first surprise is always the shape. In photographs, the ceiling floats free, disconnected from anything, and the room in your mind is a cathedral. In fact, it is a hall, a plain rectangle, about 40 meters by 13, with high walls, a barrel vault, and the proportions of a fortified box. That is not accidental. It was built between 1473 and 1481 for Sixtus IV, at a time when the papacy had real enemies inside Italy, and its walls are thick enough to have served as a refuge. There is a guard walk above the vault. Its measurements are traditionally said to follow those given in the Book of Kings for the Temple of Solomon. Whether that was intended or noticed afterwards is one of those questions that has been argued in print for 100 years without resolution. The second surprise is that Michelangelo did not decorate this room. He finished it. Look at the walls first, at eye level, because almost nobody does. The 2 long tiers of frescoes were painted between 1481 and 1482 by a team assembled from the best workshops in Italy: Perugino, Botticelli, Ghirlandaio, Cosimo Rosselli, Signorelli. On one side, scenes from the life of Moses. On the other, scenes from the life of Christ, arranged so that each Old Testament episode faces its New Testament counterpart. It is a sustained visual argument about authority passing from the law to the church, made by 5 of the finest painters alive, and it is treated by most modern visitors as wallpaper on the way to the ceiling. When Julius II handed Michelangelo the vault in 1508, the sculptor did not want it. He said, repeatedly and in writing, that painting was not his trade. He was 33, he had a marble commission he preferred, and he suspected he was being set up to fail by rivals at court. He took it anyway, because refusing a pope in 1508 was not a practical option, and he spent the next 4 years on scaffolding of his own design, standing, head tilted back, applying pigment to wet plaster in sections that had to be finished before they dried. He wrote a poem about what it did to his body. His beard pointed at heaven, his spine folded into a bow, his skin stretched at the front and bunched behind, and paint fell continually onto his face. He also complained about the money. What came out of that is above you now, mostly in darkness, resolving as your eyes adjust. 9 central panels running the length of the vault, from the separation of light from darkness at the altar end to the drunkenness of Noah at the other. Around them, seated in painted architecture that is not really there, the prophets and the sibyls, enormous figures, twisting in their frames, the Libyan sibyl turning her whole torso, Jeremiah collapsed into his own hand, Jonah at the altar end leaning back so violently that he appears to be falling out of the ceiling. At the center, the panel everyone knows, 2 hands, not touching, separated by a gap of a few centimeters, that has become the most famous empty space in Western art. There is a game people play with themselves in this room, which is to try to see it fresh. It cannot be done. The images arrived in your head decades before you did. What can be recovered, in silence, at night, is something else. The sheer physical fact of it. 300 figures, 500 square meters, 1 man on a plank, doing this daily for 4 years, with plaster drying above him on a schedule that did not negotiate. Then look at the altar wall, which is a different thing entirely, painted by a different man. Michelangelo came back nearly a quarter of a century later, in his 60s, for the Last Judgment, working from 1536 to 1541 under Paul III. The world had changed in the interval. Rome had been sacked in 1527 by mutinous imperial troops, an event of such savagery that it broke something in the confidence of the Italian Renaissance. The Reformation had hardened, and the painting reflects it, a vast churning wheel of bodies, rising and falling, around a Christ who is not the gentle figure of earlier centuries, but a powerful, almost athletic judge, arm raised, the whole composition turning around him. It caused an argument immediately. The nudity was attacked. A papal master of ceremonies who complained about it found his own face on a demon in the lower corner. After Michelangelo's death, drapery was added by other hands. The painter who did the first of it was nicknamed the Breeches Maker, and the name stuck to him for the rest of history. One more thing about the ceiling, before we leave it, because it bears on how much of what we see is really what was made. For most of the 20th century, the vault was dark, muddy, brownish, heavy, and generations of critics built entire theories on that darkness, describing Michelangelo as a sculptor who painted in shadow, a man of gloom and terribilità. Then, between 1980 and 1994, a restoration team removed the accumulated deposits of 4.5 centuries, candle smoke, lamp soot, animal glue, applied by earlier restorers to revive the colors, and simple grime. What came out from under it was startling. Pinks, apple greens, acid yellows, oranges, lilac. The palette of a man who had trained in fresco in Florence and understood exactly how much intensity wet plaster eats. The gloomy Michelangelo turned out to be a lighting condition. The restoration was fiercely attacked at the time. Serious art historians argued that a final layer of shadow had been applied by the artist himself in secco, dry, over the fresco, and that the cleaning had taken it off along with the dirt. The argument has quietened, but has never entirely ended, and it is a useful reminder that even the most examined surface in Western art is still, in part, a matter of judgment. Even this, though, is not what the room is for. The chapel is a working sacred space. Mass is said here, and once in a generation, or occasionally twice, it becomes the most watched enclosed room on earth. When a pope dies or resigns, the cardinals of the church, who are under 80 years of age, travel to Rome. They meet in this room. The doors are locked. The word conclave comes from the Latin for with a key, and the electors are cut off from outside communication for the duration. Since 1878, the voting has taken place here, beneath the judgment, which is either a coincidence of convenience or the single most pointed piece of interior design in the history of committees. The mechanics are undramatic. Each elector writes a name, folds the paper, carries it to the altar, states an oath, and places it in an urn. The votes are counted, read aloud, threaded on a needle and string. A 2/3 majority is needed. If no one reaches it, they vote again, up to 4 times a day. Then the papers are burned in a stove installed for the purpose, and the smoke goes up a temporary flue to a chimney on the roof, visible from the square below. Black smoke means no decision. White smoke means a pope has been chosen. For most of the 20th century, the color was produced by adding damp straw or dry, with results so unreliable that the crowd regularly got it wrong. Since 2005, chemical cartridges have been used, and the bells of the Basilica are rung as well, to remove the ambiguity entirely. It is worth being plain about this, because the conclave attracts a great deal of nonsense. It is a locked election with old rules and a smoke signal, conducted by men who mostly know each other, and the secrecy exists for the same reason that most ballots are secret, to reduce the pressure that would otherwise be applied from outside. That is all. There is no evidence of anything else, and the absence of windows is not itself a mystery. What is genuinely remarkable is the effect of the room on the event. This is an ordinary rectangular hall. Its power is entirely borrowed, from paint, from restriction, from repetition, from the fact that the same act has been performed in this space so many times that the space has become part of the act. Put 120 men in a bare room and you have a meeting. Put them in this room, under that ceiling, with the doors locked and the world outside watching a chimney, and you have something that 1/5 of the planet regards as consequential. Silence and restricted access are not neutral. They are materials, like marble, and this institution has always known how to build with them. Above you, the ceiling has gone almost entirely to shadow now. The custodian is standing by the door with his hand on the switch, waiting without impatience, and when the light goes off, the last thing you see is the pale shape of a raised arm on the altar wall. Beyond the chapel, the museums begin, and they go on for a very long way. By day, this is one of the most crowded routes in the world. Several million visitors a year, moving in one direction along a fixed circuit that runs, if you follow it end to end, for something like 7 kilometers. At midnight, it is a series of connected empty rooms, most of them dark, with the emergency lighting picking out the edges of doorways and the floor polished into a dull sheen by the passage of an enormous number of feet. The collection began with an accident and a purchase. In January 1506, a man digging in a vineyard near the baths of Titus on the Esquiline Hill broke into a buried chamber and found a marble group, a bearded man and 2 boys wrestling with serpents. Julius II sent his architect and, with him, a Florentine sculptor who happened to be in Rome, Michelangelo, then 30. They identified it almost at once as the Laocoon, a work described by Pliny the Elder in the 1st century and considered lost. The Pope bought it within the month and installed it in a courtyard of the Belvedere Villa. That courtyard is the seed of everything around you. Antiquities collected, displayed, argued over, drawn by students for the next 400 years. The Apollo Belvedere joined it, and the torso, which Michelangelo studied obsessively and which shows up, transformed, in the bodies on the chapel ceiling. Later popes built outward. The 18th century added the great classical museum wings under Clement XIV and Pius VI. The 19th added Egyptian and Etruscan collections. The 20th added modern religious art, and an ethnological museum of objects sent to Rome from every part of the world. The result is not a single museum, but a geological accumulation of them, each layer reflecting what a particular era thought was worth keeping. Walk the gallery of maps, and the scale of the ambition becomes physical. It is a corridor 120 meters long, gilded ceiling, and along both walls 40 painted maps of the Italian peninsula and the Papal territories, made between 1580 and 1585, to designs by a Dominican mathematician named Ignazio Danti. They are startlingly accurate for their date. They are also a statement. Here is the world, measured, drawn, and hung along a corridor that leads to the Pope's chapel. Cartography as an act of ownership. At night, the gold ceiling absorbs the low light and returns almost nothing, and the maps become pale rectangles floating in a dark tunnel. Coastlines just legible, place names invisible. The Raphael rooms are quieter. These 4 rooms were the private apartments of Julius II, who declined to live in the chambers used by his predecessor, the Borgia Pope Alexander VI, and hired a 25-year-old from Urbino to redecorate the ones above instead. Raphael worked here from 1508, at the same time that Michelangelo was on the scaffolding a short walk away, and the 2 men avoided each other with some determination. The room to stand in is the second, the Stanza della Segnatura, originally a library and a signing room. On one wall, theology. On the wall opposite, philosophy, the fresco called the School of Athens, in which the great thinkers of the ancient world are gathered under an enormous imagined vault, Plato pointing upward, Aristotle leveling his hand toward the ground, and a crowd of mathematicians and astronomers and skeptics arranged around them in conversation. There is a figure sitting alone on a block of stone in the foreground, brooding, disconnected from the discussion. It was added late, after the rest was finished, and it is widely believed to be Michelangelo, inserted by a rival who had, by then, seen the ceiling and understood what he was dealing with. 2 rooms further on, the mood darkens, a fresco of a fire in the Borgo, painted after Raphael's studio had taken over the workshop, and elsewhere the celebration of battles won and heresies defeated. This is not neutral art. It never was. The apartments of a Renaissance pope were painted to make a case. Which brings us to the honest part of walking through a great collection at night. Everything in these rooms was gathered by somebody, for a reason. Some of it was excavated from Roman soil that the papacy owned or controlled. Some was purchased, at great expense, from families in decline. Some arrived through the ordinary channels of diplomacy, gifts from monarchs, tribute, exchanges between courts. Some was commissioned outright, paid for with revenues drawn from an international church whose income came from believers who would never see any of it. Some was taken by Napoleon and later returned. The negotiator who recovered much of it, Antonio Canova, is himself represented in the sculpture galleries. And some of the ethnological material was sent from missions to Rome in the 19th and 20th centuries under circumstances that modern curators and modern source communities are still working through together, with restitution now a live and ongoing conversation. All of that can be held at once, and none of it requires either indignation or defensiveness. Collecting has always been an exercise of power, as well as an act of preservation. The 2 are not opposites. They arrive in the same crate. What is also true is that this institution kept things. Through invasions, floods, occupations, the collapse of its own political power and 2 world wars, it kept things, and a great many objects that would otherwise have been burned for lime, melted for metal, or lost in a house fire in some provincial town, are here, catalogued, intact, and available to anyone who buys a ticket. There are no cursed objects in these rooms, no sealed chambers of occult artifacts, no forbidden gallery behind a hidden panel. There are storerooms, thousands of items not currently displayed for want of wall space, a restoration laboratory with excellent equipment, and a great deal of paperwork. The mystery in a museum is never a hidden room, it is the volume. It is standing in one dark corridor at 1 in the morning, knowing that it connects to another, which connects to another, and that a person could work here for a lifetime and still not have looked properly at everything. Off the main route, there are rooms most visitors never enter, because the crowd flows past their doorways at a speed that does not permit turning aside. The Borgia apartment is one. These are the chambers Julius II refused to live in, the private rooms of Alexander VI, painted between 1492 and 1494 by Pinturicchio in gold and lapis and burnt orange, with a ceiling so densely ornamented that the eye cannot settle anywhere. In one fresco, a kneeling figure watching the resurrection is traditionally identified as the Pope himself. In another room, the theme is the liberal arts, and the whole apartment is an argument that a Renaissance prince and a spiritual leader could be the same person, made at exactly the historical moment when that proposition was becoming impossible to sustain. Elsewhere, the Egyptian collection, assembled in 1839 under Gregory XVI from objects that had been drifting around Rome since the emperors, sarcophagi, painted mummy cases, papyri, statues of gods brought to Italy by soldiers and administrators 2,000 years ago and never sent home. In the dark, at this hour, they are the oldest faces in the country. And the picture gallery, in its own building from the 1930s, arranged in chronological order across 18 rooms. Raphael's last painting, The Transfiguration, which hung at the head of his bed while he was dying at 37. An unfinished Saint Jerome by Leonardo, worked out in brown underpaint, the anatomy of the neck, done with the accuracy of a dissector, the rest never completed. A picture that was at one point cut into pieces and used as furniture before being reassembled. A Caravaggio, with its light falling like a physical object across a group of men, lowering a body into a tomb. Almost nobody sees any of it properly. The route is long, the feet hurt, and by the time a visitor arrives here, they have already spent their attention. The most valuable currency in a museum is not money, it is capacity to look, and it runs out long before the corridors do. Which is one reason to be here now, with the lights off, when nothing is available and everything is present. At the far end, a spiral staircase turns down into deeper darkness, a double helix of shallow ramps in a stone well, built in 1932 by Giuseppe Momo, in homage to a stair Bramante built 4 centuries earlier, so that people going down never meet the people coming up. You do not take it. The custodian has turned instead toward an unmarked door, and this one has a bell push beside it, and a small brass plate, too worn to read. The Vatican Apostolic Library does not look the way people expect a great library to look. There is a reading room, plain and functional, with long tables and lamps and PowerPoints for laptops, and it could be a university library anywhere in Europe, except that the security is unusual, and the request slips are handled by people who have spent decades learning what can and cannot be put on a table. There is a ceremonial hall, the Sistine Salon, built in the 1580s under Sixtus V, painted end-to-end with frescoes celebrating the great libraries of history, and it is not where the books are. The books are in stacks and vaults and climate-controlled rooms, on kilometers of shelving, arranged by an internal logic that takes years to learn. Papal book collections existed in the Middle Ages, moved with the papacy to Avignon in the 14th century, and came back diminished. The library in its recognizable form begins with Nicholas V, a scholar pope of the mid-15th century, who spent enormous sums acquiring Greek and Latin manuscripts at exactly the moment when Byzantine scholars were leaving Constantinople with whatever they could carry. Sixtus IV formalized it in 1475, appointed a librarian, established a budget and, a detail worth noticing, opened it to qualified scholars from outside the papal court. It has been a research library, not a private hoard, for 5.5 centuries. The holdings run to something over 1 million printed books, roughly 75,000 manuscripts, and thousands of incunabula, books printed in the first decades after Gutenberg, when the technology was new enough that nobody had yet decided what a printed page should look like. Among the manuscripts is a 4th century Greek Bible written on fine vellum, one of the 2 oldest substantially complete copies in existence, and the single most important witness to the text of the New Testament that survives. There are letters from kings, account books, herbals with plants drawn from life, and travel reports from places that had no name in Latin when the report was written. There is correspondence in Michelangelo's hand. There are Chinese and Arabic and Hebrew and Ethiopian manuscripts, collected across centuries by an institution that was in constant, complicated contact with the rest of the world. Very little of this is hidden. A large digitization program has been running for years, and tens of thousands of manuscripts can now be read at full resolution, free, by anyone with an internet connection and an interest. Which means that a farmer's daughter in a country the popes of the 15th century had not heard of can turn the pages of a codex that once required a letter of introduction from a cardinal. Step into the Great Hall for a moment anyway, because it is worth seeing empty. The Sistine Salon was built in the 1580s by Domenico Fontana, the same engineer who moved the obelisk, and it is a single enormous room divided by a row of piers, with a low painted vault that runs the whole length. Every surface is frescoed. Along the walls, in painted panels, are the libraries of the ancient world: Alexandria, Athens, Jerusalem, Caesarea, and the inventors of alphabets, each with his script beside him. It is a room about the survival of writing, painted at a moment when Europe had just discovered how fragile that survival was, and it is decorated so densely that it takes several minutes to understand that the whole scheme is one continuous argument. At night, the frescoes go flat, and the room becomes a long, pale tunnel, and the cases down the center hold objects that are simply covered with cloth after closing. Consider what actually has to happen for a text to reach this building. Someone had to write it. Someone else had to think it worth copying, and find parchment, which meant a herd of animals, and ink, and months of labor. That copy had to survive fire, damp, mice, war, and the periodic collapse of the institutions that housed it. Then somebody had to think it worth copying again, a century or 2 later, in a different script, in a different country. Repeat that 6 or 7 times, across 1,000 years, with the odds against survival at every stage, and you arrive at a single volume that a scholar can request tomorrow morning with a slip of paper. The chain of custody is the miracle, not the object. There is a category of manuscript here that makes the point better than any other. A palimpsest is a page that was scraped clean and reused, a 5th century text of Cicero, erased by a monk who needed parchment for a psalter, the older writing lost. Under modern multispectral imaging, the residue of the original ink fluoresces, and the erased words come back. Whole works of ancient literature have been recovered this way, from beneath the very texts that destroyed them in the last few decades. Somebody's carelessness in the year 700 turns out to have been the only reason the earlier text survived at all. If he had thrown the page away, there would be nothing. Because he was thrifty, there is a ghost. But stand in the stacks for a moment with the lights on low. What gets you is not the value. It is the handwriting. Every manuscript on these shelves was made by a person sitting down. Someone ruled the lines. Someone mixed the ink and cut the quill and copied out a text that they may or may not have understood in a room that was probably cold, by a window or a candle, for hours, for months. Some of them made mistakes and corrected them in the margin. Some got bored. The marginal doodles of medieval scribes are a whole field of study, full of complaints about the cold, the poor light, and the length of the text. One wrote that 3 fingers hold the pen, but the whole body labors. Those people are entirely gone. Not merely dead, gone, without a name in most cases, without a face, without a single other trace on the earth. And the loops of their letters are still here, still perfectly legible, waiting on a shelf in the dark, in a building they never heard of. in a century they could not have conceived of. That is the emotional weight of an old library, and it has nothing to do with secrets. It is the sheer improbability of survival. Nearly everything ever written has been lost. Fire, damp, mice, war, indifference. The reuse of parchment, the collapse of the political arrangements that funded the copying. The default fate of a text is disappearance. What sits here is the tiny fraction that made it through, mostly by luck. And the reason it made it through is that at every point in a long and often violent history, somebody decided that the copying and the keeping should continue. There is no vault here containing suppressed gospels or supernatural revelation. Restricted items exist, as in any research library. Material too fragile to handle, items under conservation, a small number of documents concerning living persons. That is the whole of it. The mystery of this place, again, is quantity. Kilometers of shelving. A scholar could spend a working life on a single shelf and publish 3 books and know that they had merely opened a window on it. Outside the reading room, in the corridor, a trolley of returned volumes waits for the morning, each one in a padded cradle, each with a slip of paper marking a page. Somebody was in the middle of something when the day ended. They will be back at 9. The custodian is already moving on. There is one more door tonight, and it is the one people ask about. The Vatican Apostolic Archive is the most misunderstood institution in Europe, and almost all of the confusion comes from one Latin word. Until 2019, its official title translated into English as the Vatican's Secret Archive, and for most of the 20th century, that phrase did an enormous amount of work in the popular imagination. The Latin is secretum, and in this context, it does not mean secret in the modern sense. It means private, separate, set apart. The same usage that gives a private secretary his title, or a king his privy council. It was the Pope's own archive, as distinct from the public records of the various offices around him. By the 21st century, the word had become actively misleading in English, so the name was changed to Apostolic Archive. Building did not change. The rules did not change. Only the label, which had spent decades feeding 100 novels. Here is what is actually inside. The archive was formally established in 1612 under Paul V, gathering scattered papal records into one place. Some of the material it absorbed is far older. The earliest documents run back to the 8th century, though the medieval survival rate is poor, and a great deal was lost during the removal of the papacy to Avignon, and during Napoleon's decision to transport the whole archive to Paris in 1810, from which it returned incomplete and in disorder. What remains is measured in shelving, and the figure usually given is around 85 kilometers. Registers of papal correspondence, running in more or less unbroken series from the 13th century. The administrative record of a very large organization, appointments, disputes, finances, property, permissions. Diplomatic correspondence with almost every European power and later with most of the world. The records of tribunals. Petitions from ordinary people, in enormous numbers, about marriages and inheritances and grievances. A few individual items are famous. There is a petition from 1530, signed and sealed by dozens of English lords and clergy, urging the Pope to grant Henry V the annulment he wanted. A document from which more than 80 wax seals still hang on ribbons, and which failed entirely in its purpose. There is a parchment recording the interrogation of the leaders of the Knights Templar at Chinon in 1308, in which Clement V absolved them of heresy, a document that was not hidden but was misfiled for centuries and was rediscovered in the archive's own holdings in 2001. There are the trial documents of Galileo. There is a letter from the great Khan of the Mongols to Innocent IV in 1246, on paper, in Persian, with a red seal, informing the Pope with total confidence that he should come and submit in person. There is a letter to Leo the Tall's from a group of Ojibwe leaders, written on birch bark. There is one more thing to understand about the opening of the archive, because it is easy to say and hard to do. When Leo Searchais made the decision in 1881, he was not making a public relations gesture. The papacy in that decade had just lost its territory, was refusing to recognize the Italian state, and was widely regarded across liberal Europe as an obscurantist relic. Opening the records to hostile historians was a genuine risk, taken deliberately, on the argument that the truth of what happened was less dangerous than the rumors filling the vacuum. That argument has been tested repeatedly since, and has not always been honored quickly, and the delays have generally cost more than the disclosures. The mechanics of research here remain unglamorous. A scholar applies with credentials and a stated project. Admission is granted for a period. The reading room is open on weekday mornings and closes for much of the summer. Requests are limited to a few items at a time, pencils only. The material arrives on a trolley, and what arrives is very often a bound volume of dense, abbreviated Latin in a hand that takes a specialist several years of training to read fluently. Whole careers are spent on a single pontificate. A doctoral thesis might rest on 11 volumes out of a series of 900. And the great discoveries, when they come, are almost never the ones the public expects. They are things like a run of correspondence that establishes the actual price of grain in a papal territory during a famine, or a set of dispensations that shows how marriage law was really applied to ordinary people, rather than how it was written. The dramatic documents get the headlines. The bulk records rewrite the history. The physical arrangement is undramatic. There are reading rooms with plain desks. There is an underground bunker built in the early 1980s beneath a courtyard, 2 stories of steel shelving and fire suppression, and controlled humidity, because paper is fragile and Rome floods. There are conservation workshops where damaged parchment is stabilized by people wearing magnifying visors, and there is access. For most of its history, the archive was closed to outsiders. That ended in 1881, when Leo XIII opened it to scholars, a decision that was controversial at the time, taken by a pope who reportedly said that the Church had nothing to fear from history. Since then, qualified researchers with academic credentials and a letter of introduction have been admitted to the reading rooms. Access is organized by pontificate, and the rule is essentially chronological. Material becomes available once a given papacy has been fully catalogued, and enough time has elapsed for the people named in it to be beyond harm. That process is slow, because cataloguing 85 kilometers of handwritten paper is slow. The records of Pius XI up to 1939 were opened in 2006. The records of the war years under Pius XII, the most requested and most contested body of material in the building, were opened to researchers in 2020, at which point historians from several countries began working through them, and the arguments they had been having for 60 years continued with better evidence. That is what a closed archive opening actually looks like. Not a revelation, a queue of academics, a booking system, and a decade of careful, contested publication. It is worth stating clearly what is not there, since the vacuum has been filled so enthusiastically for so long. There is no suppressed gospel that dismantles Christianity. There is no evidence of extraterrestrial contact. There are no prescribed books of magic. No proof of an ancient conspiracy running the world from behind a bookcase. Historians have been in these rooms every working day for over 140 years, from every country and every position of belief and unbelief, including many who would have made their entire careers on such a discovery. The genuine mystery here is quieter and considerably more affecting. 85 kilometers is a distance you could not walk in a day. Every meter of it is paper, and every sheet of paper was produced because something happened to somebody. A parish priest wrote about a flood. A widow petitioned for the return of a property. A nuncio in a distant capital reported on a king's health. A bishop asked what to do about a famine. 2 villages disputed a boundary in a year, when nothing else about either village was recorded anywhere. Most of those people are entirely unknown, and most of those documents have not been read by anyone since the clerk who filed them. Not because they are forbidden, because there are too many, and there is only so much time, and human attention is finite in a way that paper is not. Somewhere on those shelves tonight, in the dark, in the controlled cool air, there is a letter that somebody wrote in tears, sealed, and sent to Rome, and no living person knows what it says. That is the real secret of the secret archive. Not concealment, excess. The overwhelming, unmanageable, faithfully preserved volume of ordinary human life, kept because keeping is what this institution does, waiting patiently for a reader who may never arrive. The corridor outside the archive has no windows. Your footsteps have become quieter without your deciding it. There is a job here that almost nobody thinks about, and at this hour, it is the only job being done. Somebody has to close all of this. Every evening, after the last visitors have gone, a small team walks the museums in a fixed order, room by room, checking that nobody has fallen asleep on a bench or wandered into a side gallery and lost track of the time. It happens more often than you would think. Then the shutters, the alarms, the section lighting, the doors, hundreds of doors, in a sequence that has to be followed exactly, because the buildings interlock in ways that no single floor plan quite captures. The keys are famous among people who work here. There are said to be roughly 3,000 of them, some modern, many not, kept in a room and issued against signature, and a particular set is used to open the Basilica at dawn and close it at night. Certain of those keys are large enough to require both hands and are older than most of the countries they are protected by. The men who carry them are called the clavigeri, from the Latin for key-bearer, and the role has been passed along in the same handful of Roman families for generations. A father teaching a son the order of the locks, the door that sticks in damp weather, the trick of the mechanism on the north side. Nothing about that is mystical. It is maintenance. But it is maintenance conducted with such continuity that it has become indistinguishable from ritual, and that is a pattern you have now seen 4 or 5 times tonight without my pointing at it. Out in the courtyards, the guards. The Pontifical Swiss Guard was founded in 1506, when Julius II recruited a company of soldiers from the Swiss cantons, whose mercenaries were then the most respected infantry in Europe. 21 years later, during the sack of Rome in 1527, imperial troops broke into the city, and the Guard fought a holding action on the steps of the Basilica, while Clement VII escaped along the covered wall to the fortress by the river. Most of them died, around 147 of a company of 189. New recruits are still sworn in on the anniversary of that day. To join, a man must be Swiss, Catholic, unmarried, between 19 and 30, of a certain minimum height, and must already have completed Swiss military training. The force is small, well under 150. They are not ceremonial ornaments. They are trained soldiers who happen to wear the most conspicuous uniform in the world, and that uniform is not, despite what you have almost certainly been told, a design by Michelangelo or Raphael. It was created in 1914 by a commandant named Jules Répond, who looked at Renaissance paintings and built something new from them. It is barely a century old, and it was designed to look 4 centuries older, which is, when you think about it, one of the most honest artifacts in the whole city, a piece of invented tradition, made deliberately, and now so thoroughly absorbed that pointing it out feels like bad manners. Day-to-day policing is handled by a separate body, the gendarmerie, in dark uniforms you would not photograph. At 2 in the morning, the guard posts are quiet. A man stands at an archway with his hands behind his back, shifting his weight occasionally, watching a courtyard where nothing whatsoever is happening. Somewhere a radio produces 2 words and then stops. In a small room off a corridor, there is a kettle, a fluorescent light, 3 chairs, and a rota pinned to a corkboard with the names of people who will be in this building on Thursday. The custodian who let you in has been on since the afternoon. He has good shoes. Everyone who works here has good shoes, because the floors are stone and the distances are long, and there is a specific expression that comes over people at this hour, which has nothing to do with the sacred and everything to do with the last 4 hours of a shift. You pass a cleaner working a machine slowly across a marble floor, the sound of it swelling and fading through an archway. You pass an open storeroom with a stepladder and a coil of cable. Somebody has left a jacket over the back of a chair beneath a 17th century ceiling. Lamps go out behind you as you move. Not dramatically, just the ordinary economy of a large building at night, section by section, in the order the switches are arranged. And there is the other half of the country, which almost never appears in any account of it. The parts that exist because a state, however small, has to function. There is a post office, and it works notably better than the Italian one, which is why Romans have been known to cross the border to send things. There is a pharmacy, small and busy, which supplies medicines that are sometimes hard to obtain elsewhere in Italy. There is a supermarket for residents and staff, and a petrol station, and a cash machine that once offered Latin among its menu languages, which is either charming or absurd, depending on the hour at which you encounter it. There is a railway station, built in the 1930s, with the shortest national rail network in the world, a few hundred meters of track through a gate in the wall. Almost nothing runs on it. There is a fire brigade. There is a newspaper, printed daily. There is a radio service, founded in 1931, with the involvement of Marconi himself, which broadcasts in dozens of languages, and which, during the Second World War, was used to pass information about missing persons and prisoners across a continent that had stopped communicating with itself. There is an observatory, with roots in the 16th century and the reform of the calendar, which today maintains a telescope on a mountain in Arizona because the sky over Rome is too bright to work in, an institution that publishes peer-reviewed astronomy and is staffed largely by Jesuits. There are gardeners, there are electricians, there is a woman somewhere in the payroll office who knows exactly how many people are entitled to use the supermarket. Citizenship here is unusual. It is attached to function, not to birth. You hold it while you serve, and when the service ends, so does the citizenship, which means this is a country that nobody is from, a state with a population of a few hundred, no natives, no children growing up expecting to inherit it, and a continuous turnover of everyone in it. The buildings stay, the people rotate through, and this is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is the answer to a question the whole night has been circling. What holds an institution together across 2,000 years is not the ceiling frescoes. It is the fact that at 2:30 on an unremarkable morning, in a corridor nobody will ever photograph, a man in his 50s is walking a route his predecessor walked, locking doors in an order that was established before he was born, and that he will teach to somebody else before he retires. Grandeur is what an institution shows the world. Repetition is what keeps it alive. Ahead, the corridor opens onto a loggia, and beyond the arches, there is the smell of cut grass and wet earth, which is the gardens, and which means you have crossed most of the country tonight without noticing. Stand under the arches for a while. There is no rush now, and the rest of the night is downhill. Everything you have walked through tonight was built to do a job, and the job was not only worship. Consider the tools laid end to end. Architecture that arranges your emotions before anyone speaks to you. A square with arms. A nave that shrinks you by proportion rather than by height. A staircase that widens as you climb it, so that the space seems to open in welcome. None of this is written down as instruction. It works on the body, and it works on people who do not believe a word of the theology, which is precisely the point. Art that communicates faster than language. In a period when most of Europe could not read, a wall of painted scenes was not decoration, it was the text, and the reading of it was directed. This figure larger, this one in gold, this one at the center with the light behind him. Images have always been the most efficient carrier of an idea, and the Church understood the economics of that 1,000 years before anyone invented advertising. Ritual repeated until it becomes ground rather than event. The same words, in the same order, in the same room, on the same day of the year, across so long a span that the repetition itself becomes an argument for permanence. If a thing has always been done, it acquires the appearance of always. Records that outlast the people who made them. An institution that remembers what happened 300 years ago, in writing, has an enormous advantage over one that does not, in law, in diplomacy, in property, and in the simple ability to say with authority what was agreed. Diplomacy that runs across borders rather than within them, conducted by an entity with no army and therefore no threat, which is a surprisingly strong position in certain rooms. Clothing and ceremony that mark rank instantly and without argument, and underneath all of them, the perception of continuity, the sense that this arrangement of things preceded your birth and will continue after your death, which changes how a person relates to it. You do not negotiate with something you understand to be older than your family line. You situate yourself relative to it. The clothing and the ceremony deserve a moment of their own, because they are the most concentrated example of everything else. Consider the ring. Each pope receives a signet, the fisherman's ring, showing Peter in a boat with a net, and for centuries it functioned as a working seal, pressed into wax on documents to prove they came from him and nobody else. When he died, the ring was destroyed in front of witnesses, scored across with a chisel or broken with a hammer, so that nothing further could be issued in his name. That is a security procedure. It is also theater. And the two are not in tension. The reason it works as theater is that it is genuinely a security procedure. And the reason it works as security is that everyone has watched it happen. Consider the keys. 2 of them crossed, 1 gold and 1 silver, on the arms of the Holy See and on the paving of the square, and above doorways all over this city. They refer to a single sentence in Matthew's Gospel about the keys of the kingdom, and they have become so thoroughly the visual identity of the institution that a person can recognize them without knowing the verse, the language, or the argument. Consider the white cassock, which is often assumed to be ancient and is generally traced to the 16th century, and a Dominican pope who simply kept wearing the white habit of his own order after his election. A personal habit became an office. The office became an image. The image became, within a few generations, the most recognizable garment in the world. And consider what has been given up. The tiara, the triple crown, worn at coronations for the better part of 1,000 years, was set aside in the 1960s, laid on an altar and given away, and no pope since has been crowned. The portable throne carried on the shoulders of attendants is gone. The ostrich feather fans are gone. The plural form once used by popes to refer to themselves is largely gone. Institutions that survive do not merely accumulate symbols. They edit them, occasionally sharply, and the editing is itself a message about what the institution now wishes to be. A crown removed says something as loudly as a crown worn, and everybody understands it immediately, without a word of explanation, which is exactly the property that makes symbols worth having in the first place. There is a further mechanism worth naming, because it is the least visible and possibly the most powerful of all: the management of time itself. Ordinary institutions operate on the horizon of a career, an election cycle, a quarterly report. This one has, at various points, made decisions with a horizon of centuries. Commissioning a building that would take 6 generations, cutting glass mosaics because paint would not last, keeping records for people not yet born, opening an archive by pontificate on a schedule that assumes the institution will still exist to complete it. That does something to how the place behaves. It can absorb losses that would destroy a shorter-lived body. It lost the Papal States and continued. It lost half of Western Christianity in the 16th century and continued. It was invaded, occupied, stripped of its archive by Napoleon and continued. The capacity to lose comprehensively and carry on is a form of strength that is very difficult to acquire deliberately, and it comes almost entirely from the belief, held internally, transmitted through ritual, that the institution is not identical to its current circumstances. Whether one shares the faith behind that or not, the organizational fact is remarkable. Almost nothing else in Europe has managed it. The empires are gone, the kingdoms are gone or ornamental. The banking houses of Florence and Augsburg are gone. The universities that come closest are younger and were, in most cases, founded by this same institution. What remains is a set of rooms, a body of records, a sequence of gestures, and an unbroken list of names. It is tempting to describe all of that as manipulation, and some of it, at some points in history, plainly has been. But the honest version is more interesting. Every enduring institution does this. Nations do it. Flags, anthems, oaths, uniforms, ceremonies of remembrance. Buildings deliberately made to look older than they are. Universities do it, with gowns and Latin and processions. Armies, courts, banks, monarchies, and even the corporations of the last 100 years all reach for the same instruments, and reach for them almost immediately, because human beings simply do not commit to abstractions. We commit to things we can stand inside. What is unusual here is not the method, it is the duration. This is the same method, in the same location, run continuously for longer than any other functioning institution in the Western world. Long enough that the results are visible in stone, and long enough that the shortcomings are equally visible in the record, because the record includes a great deal that is difficult. There were centuries in which the office you are standing at the heart of was traded among Roman families like a piece of property. There was a period when the papacy resided in Avignon, effectively within the orbit of the French crown, and a longer period after it, when rival claimants excommunicated one another, and Europe had to choose between 2 popes, and briefly 3. There were popes with children, popes who bought the office outright, and popes whose principal interest was in the advancement of their nephews, a habit that gave the English language the word nepotism. There was an index of prohibited books, maintained for 4 centuries, which suppressed the circulation of texts that are now taught to undergraduates. There were tribunals of inquisition, whose procedures were in some respects more careful than the secular courts of the period, and whose purpose was nonetheless the identification and punishment of belief. There was Galileo, tried in 1633, made to renounce a correct description of the heavens, and kept under house arrest until his death, a case the Church itself revisited and formally regretted in the 20th century. There were wars blessed, alliances made with regimes that should have been refused, silences kept when speech was owed. There were, in our own lifetime, the abuse of children by clergy, and the failure of bishops to act on what they knew, a failure that caused profound and lasting harm, that took far too long to be acknowledged, and that continues to shape how many people, including many faithful Catholics, regard the institution. None of that is served by either sensationalism or omission, and it should be held alongside the rest of the record, which is not thin: the preservation of classical learning through the collapse of Roman order, the establishment of the university, hospitals and orphanages when nobody else was building them, the reform movements that arose repeatedly from inside the Church against its own corruption, the missionaries who catalogued dying languages, the priests who died in camps, the enormous quiet machinery of ordinary parish life across 180 countries. The category error that ruins most storytelling about this place is treating it as one actor with one intention across 2,000 years. It has never been that. It is millions of people, in every generation, in violent disagreement with each other, some of them saints by any measure, and some of them criminals by any measure, wearing the same insignia and standing in the same rooms. Faith is one thing, believers are another. The men who have held office are a third. The institution that surrounds them, changing constantly while insisting on its own continuity, is a fourth. Keep those four separate, and the history becomes comprehensible. Collapse them into one, and you get either propaganda or conspiracy, and both of them are less interesting than what actually happened. Out beyond the arches, something moves in the dark. A cat, crossing a gravel path without any urgency at all, on business of its own. The gardens take up nearly half the country. Almost no one sees them. They occupy the high ground behind the Basilica, rising toward the old wall, and they have been cultivated since the 13th century, when a pope planted an orchard and a vineyard here and put a fence around it. Since then, they have been added to by everyone. A formal Italian garden with clipped hedges, an English section with lawns and specimen trees, a small French parterre, palms, umbrella pines, roses, a replica of the grotto at Lourdes, and a 16th century summer house of extraordinary delicacy sitting in the middle of it all, where the Pontifical Academy of Sciences now meets. At night it is simply a garden, damp air, the smell of box hedge and turned soil, gravel that announces every step, so that you find yourself walking on the grass. The fountains here are older and smaller than the ones in the square, and they run all night as well. One of them is set in a wall and produces a sound like a tap left half on in a distant room. Water has been coming down from the hills into this city for 2,000 years through channels that some emperor paid for, and it has not been asked to stop. Above the trees, the back of the dome, floodlit from below, appears to be resting on nothing. There is a bell tower on the left of the facade, and a clock, and in the small hours the bells mark the quarters for nobody at all. The sound carries out over the square, across the river, into streets where a few windows are still yellow, and then it stops, and the silence closes over it, the way water closes over a stone. The pigeons are asleep in the colonnade. They roost in the same places every night, tucked into the shadow of the entablature, and if you look up you can see the small rounded shapes of them along the cornice, quite still. The gulls are asleep on the roofs. A single light is on somewhere high in the palace, in a corridor rather than a room, left burning because someone will need it at 5. Turn slowly, here, on the path, and take in the size of what you have crossed. It is not large. That is the last surprise. You could stand in this garden and see, in one turn of the head, the roof of the archive, the wall of the museums, the top of the chapel, the drum of the basilica, and the lit windows of the guard post at the gate, all of it inside a wall you could walk in under an hour. Everything from tonight is in that circle. The street of Roman tombs, the shrine and the bones and the argument about them, the scaffolding and the aching neck, the locked room with its chimney, the maps and the trolley of returned books, 85 kilometers of paper, 3,000 keys. The buildings have gone quiet now, in the way that buildings do when the people leave. Not dead, but idling. Stone releasing the day's warmth, a shutter settling. Somewhere a pipe knocking twice, and then thinking better of it. Inside them, the painted figures are still there in the dark. That is the thought that stays at the end of a night like this. Thousands upon thousands of faces on ceilings and walls and altarpieces, in rooms with no one in them, prophets and sibyls, saints and angels, philosophers arguing under a painted vault, a man reaching toward a hand that will never quite reach back. Their eyes are open. They were painted with their eyes open, and they will be like that until morning, and then all day while the crowds go past beneath them, and then all night again. They have done this every night since the paint dried. Think of everything under this one small piece of ground, arranged in order, going down, the night air, the stone of the square still holding a trace of the day, the paving and the drains beneath it, and the older paving beneath those, the foundations of a colonnade sunk into Roman fill. Below that, the ground where a circus once stood, and where a track was raked smooth, for chariots that have not run for 1900 years. Below that, the tombs with their painted birds and their family names and their little benches, and below all of it, the plain, unremarkable hillside, wet clay and gravel, which was here before any of this, and will be here afterwards, and which has never once been asked its opinion. None of it is going anywhere tonight. The custodian is walking you back now, down the gravel, through the loggia, along a corridor that you recognize from earlier, without being able to say why. The lamps ahead go on as you approach, and off again behind. Past the door with the worn brass plate, past the stairs you did not take, across the courtyard with its 2 stars, which have moved, the Basilica again, from the outside this time, the great flank of it going up into the dark, and then the colonnade, and the square. It has changed. The floodlights on the facade have been dimmed to a low amber, and the air has gone cold, the way it does at the far end of a night. The obelisk is a dark line. The fountains are still going. The saints along the roofline have become shapes only. Somewhere beyond the wall, a scooter starts up and fades along the river. Rome is beginning to turn over in its sleep. You are standing near the middle of the square now, on stone that is damp under your hand, and there is nothing left to look at that you have not looked at. The door is behind you, the same small door in the larger one. The custodian has the key out. He is not hurrying. He has done this 10,000 times, and there is no version of it that requires speed. You could ask him something. There is time, but the questions have gone soft at the edges, the way questions do when it is very late, and none of them seems to need answering tonight. What is under the altar? Who wrote the letter nobody has read? Whether the shrine marks what it is said to mark. Let them stay where they are. They have kept for 2,000 years without your help. They will keep until morning. He steps back through the doorway. He tilts his head slightly, the way he did at the start, and this time it means something different. The door closes, the bolt goes across, deep and soft, a sound like a book being shut in another room, and that is all. The square is empty again. The water keeps falling into the basins, over the rim, into the lower bowl, over and over, with no one to hear it. The stone is cooling. The lamps are dim and gold and very far apart. Above the roofline, the sky has that particular quality it takes on in the last hours, when it is no longer properly dark, but nowhere near light, and the highest windows of the palace are simply grey. Nothing here needs watching. The Basilica does not need you awake to remain standing. It stood through the night before this one, and every night before that. The archive is cool and dry, and perfectly still, its papers in order on their shelves, its letters unread and undisturbed. The library trolley is waiting by the door. The chapel is dark, and the ceiling is dark, and the arm is still raised where you last saw it. The tombs beneath the floor are as quiet as they have been since the 4th century. Nobody is watching any of it. It goes on anyway. That is the thing that becomes restful in the end. Not the grandeur, the permanence of things that do not require your attention. Let your shoulders come down from wherever they have been holding. There is nothing to attend to now. The doors are locked from the inside by someone whose job it is. The lights are set for the night. The temperature in the archive is held steady by a system that runs without anyone watching it. The fountains do not need to be told. This is a place that has been looking after itself since long before you were born, and it will manage the next few hours without you. Somewhere above, the painted figures keep their eyes open in the dark, and the gold in the mosaics holds the last of the lamplight, and the marble goes on cooling by fractions of a degree, all night, very slowly, the way it does every night. Let the pictures go now. Let the corridors close one by one. Cool stone, dim gold light, water, somewhere, falling and falling into a basin it has been falling into for 400 years. And the dark above the city, wide and steady and entirely untroubled, holding everything exactly where it is until morning. You can put it all down now. The dates can go first. They were never the point. Let the numbers loosen and drift off. The year of the treaty, the year of the sealing, the year of the excavation. They will be there in the morning if you want them. Then the names. Let those go too. Then the corridors, one at a time, the way the lamps went out behind you. The gardens, the gravel, the loggia, the long gallery with the maps, the stairs, the cold air below the floor, the great empty nave. What is left is simpler. Cool stone, dim gold light, water falling somewhere out of sight. A door closed gently by someone who has closed it many times before. The weight of a very old place settling into itself for a few more hours. Your breathing has slowed. It has been slowing for a while. There is nothing to decide, nothing to remember, nothing to carry. The city sleeps around the small country at its center, and the small country sleeps too, holding its layers quietly one above another. The garden above the palace above the chapel above the marble above the grottos above the old brick street where the lamps have never once been lit. All of it still, all of it safe. The dark above Rome is steady and unhurried, and the fountains go on, and the doors are closed, and everything that has been kept is still being kept. Rest now. Sleep into power, guys. Good night.